In the 20 years that we've been operating around the world, our land work has been predominantly in the Africa region. As with all of our programs, the focus of what we do exactly in the land sector depends on what the specific constraint problem is in a given country and what the country's priorities might be. But I will say that typically we invest in some combination of policy and legal reform, land administration, institution strengthening or institution building, and then land rights recognition, titling, regularization, formalization in selected areas of a given country. Our work is rural and urban, but I will say that our ag-related work really cuts across kind of the entire continuum from, smallholder farmer plots to peri-urban parcels of land that are used for warehousing, processing, other kinds of facilities. So we work. We're sort of agnostic to rural or urban, and as with all of our ag investing, we're really looking across the value chain, and that's defined by what the particular priority in a given country is. And the reason we do this, and the reason that we care about land and land rights in an ag context, is the logic that we rely on for our land work and many of our investments, which is stronger land rights, better performing land-related institutions, better managed land over time, and with the right pieces of the puzzle in place can lead to increased investment, increased land productivity, and increased incomes, which is what we're looking for. Next. The piece of our work that I want to talk about today and give a little bit of visibility to is the records and record-keeping technology that is very often a big piece of protecting land rights over time. And so there's a lot of work that I'm sure many of you are familiar with around identifying rights and boundaries on a plot-by-plot basis in a given location. A lot of really exciting tools that can be used for that work. But the long-term protection of those rights also depends on what are the rights registry, rights recording systems. These are sort of information management, filing systems. What are the records organization systems that responsible institutions, individuals are using to keep track of rights over time, keep track of changes, updates, transactions over time to make sure that people can have long-term benefits from rights that have been formalized as a result of an initiative of their government that MCC may have funded. And what we have found over the 20 years of our work, and most anyone else who works in the land space would also say this, there's a really extraordinary variety in the complexity of institutions, the complexity of land markets, the complexity of the context that we're working in. And so the capabilities and the infrastructure to maintain well-functioning record systems can vary widely, right? Sometimes we are formalizing rights of smallholders in a country that has decentralized rights protection and rights recognition to village level or commune level authorities. Other times we're supporting national governments with a nationally reaching land rights registry system that is being used for high value, very active urban land markets. And so the record keeping needs and the officials and the technology and the institutions to manage all that can vary widely. And so as we did our final project evaluations, and this is something Sarah will be talking more about, our results were mixed. In a lot of our early projects, governments were interested in getting MCC support to develop a digitized land rights registry system. And so we would invest in these systems, and we were always looking at the sustainability post-project. How well is the system still being used? Are officials still relying on it? Are citizens and landholders still relying on it? And sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't. And so we started to ask ourselves, not only why is that, but probably even more importantly, what can we do next time to make better decisions about the kind of technology that we're investing in so that record systems are better able to sustain protection for kind of hard-won land rights over the long term. And we really wanted to allow ourselves and give ourselves some tools and some modalities for really identifying in a consistent way and getting a better answer every time we're making an investment to the question of what level of technology is the right one, right? How do we avoid doing too much technology or too complex a system that can't be maintained, or the reverse, which is sort of too little complexity and we're missing out on opportunities for sort of preparing certain jurisdictions, communities for technological change in the future. And so pull out your phone, grab this QR code. What we developed during the years of like 2019, 20, 21, 22, this was a pandemic project. And we've called it the Land Rights Records and Transaction System Toolkit. Decision-making toolkit, I think, is in the title somewhere. And basically what this is it's basically a workbook. It's about over 100 PDF slides with worksheets that allow governments, donors, researchers, service providers, software system providers, advisors, consultants to do a very systematic analysis of where is this community, country, district, municipality today with respect to the rights information that they currently manage, the resources that they have in place to fund those systems in the future, the technology infrastructure that they have available to them. Is there stable electricity, internet? If so, great. If not, that's an important thing to know before designing better systems for record keeping. And so it allows kind of a systematic view of all of the pieces of this sort of optimal records management technology question, and then leads users through an assessment of what are the different options, what's a low technology option, a medium technology option, a high technology option, what are the pros and cons of each approach, what are the risks of each approach, what are the costs involved both today and kind of over time in the future in terms of total cost of ownership, and really leads users towards gathering and systematizing information to help governments and others supporting them make the best decisions possible about what to invest in. So I would just I'll end here. I want to encourage everyone to take a look at the materials. They're all online. We wanted to make sure that they're available to others. We're using them, but we want other people to be able to use them as well. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that while the focus is on records for land administration, land rights registration, much of the tool focuses on questions that are pretty universal to record systems or technology systems in any sector on any subject. So don't think that it's only for land projects. People with a variety of interests and a variety of objectives may find some useful components to help frame and organize better analysis and better decision making around system investing. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Jill. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kai Gass. I'm on MCC's agriculture team. Slide here. Hopefully everyone caught the QR code. Come on in, just for the best part. Just kidding. Jill kind of made the link already between land and agriculture, so I don't think it's going to be too abrupt of a shift. But again, we want to kind of link the two, talking about how we evaluate these types of investments. But I think before we start talking about the impact of our investments, I'll just take a quick chance to briefly talk about what those investments look like and what we do. So if you all remember the number that Casey mentioned in terms of what our compacts, our investment size looks like, I think she said 400 million is the average. That's a lot of resources. So it shouldn't be too big of a surprise that our partner governments really want to focus on infrastructure. I can call it low tech for the purpose of today. So that's road infrastructure, electrification, things that connect farmers to markets and help a country build its processing sector. I'll use our most recent example in Niger. Their The compact was $442 million, so just a little bit above the average. And of course, the big concrete investments behind that were roads and irrigation infrastructure. Also other rural infrastructure like livestock markets, and also, low tech, but really important, financing the national livestock vaccination for the whole national herd. These are hugely important low tech investments, but one of the winning combos that we've found working with our partner countries is to couple policy and institutional reform that goes along with those investments. So in some cases, infrastructure, it's logical that you'd want road maintenance to accompany the actual rural roads that we're financing to make sure they are maintained and that farmers can use them well into the future. But sometimes it's things that are a little bit more complicated, and a partner like MCC can really fill in the gap of being the one that's pushing. I mean, these are still, Casey made the point on country ownership, that is a leading feature, but sometimes that partnership can entail tackling difficult, stubborn reforms. So Niger, which is just concluding, was our one of our largest agriculture programs in MCC's history. We supported the government on fertilizer reform, so allowing the private sector to come in. And there's a good opportunity where we're able to put in some technology to help solve these sticky situations, like how do you target vouchers? And so even here you'll see a photo in the right that shows a smallholder farmer turning in their e-voucher to receive the subsidy. Governments will always want to continue to do subsidies. What can we do to make these subsidies smarter, more well-targeted? Also, I would like to still stay on Niger and give another example of sort of an ICT solution that we have incorporated using LiDAR technology, which I unfortunately cannot, I'm not the person to ask. I'm sure someone in one of these rooms does know how these things work, but we're able to use remote sensing to actually detect where groundwater is most likely to be found, something incredibly important for a Sahelian country like Niger, and allows for better planning and helping farmers be able to more reasonably tap into available resources. One of our big catchphrases at the end of that work was that we found Niger to be one of the most groundwater-rich country in the Sahel, which will be incredibly important for its agricultural development. And then I don't want to leave out some of our what you can almost call medium tech solutions. Things that might not sound flashy or interesting, but are incredibly important. So I'll make a brief mention on our Mozambique work that's right now in development. We're helping the government on how they tax agricultural investment. I mean, it sounds so boring, but how important is it to make sure that folks are willing to invest in rural areas, making sure that the incentives are there, that if you're promised a reimbursement for your expenses, that you're going to get that back from the government. There's an area where MCC's found really, like I said, a good winning combo of combining important infrastructure that rural areas desperately need to connect to markets, but with the right incentives to make sure that that infrastructure is being fully utilized. So there's just more rural investment. We call them sometimes preconditions to our investment or conditions precedent. And again, it's in support of making sure that this infrastructure is being used. And then just a quick note as well. One thing that is of note in our Lesotho Compact. Again, you can access our website and find out where we work, what sectors we work in. It's a very transparent agency, as Casey mentioned. But a quick note, since we're talking technology and ICT, we are working in Lesotho to try to improve the availability of cold storage. And so, in the near future, there'll be a call for, I think it's a challenge, call for new ideas. I can't remember quite the terminology, but looking for new proposals on how you can more efficiently and cost effectively chill perishable horticultural goods and get them to market. And then again, before I turn it over to start talking about evaluating the impact of these projects, I'd be remiss, since we're here at IFPRI, to not mention one of the ways we've partnered with, I'll say, you know, the community of knowledge and everything that, you know, IFPRI and its partners and all the folks that are motivated enough to come here and talk about ICT4Ag have done in the past. We have worked on a toolkit, so very similar. In a second, I'm going to put up the QR code, and I hope I get as many phones as Jill had earlier. But as part of that toolkit, we're using geographic prioritization to be able to figure out where those infrastructure investments are going to have the biggest impact. And so again, partnering with IFPRI on how to build those models, figuring out, you know, where the cost of production makes sense, along with the distance to market, where you can shorten it, just so our partner countries are really able to more quickly and easily prioritize what's a really long list of needs. That's one thing here. I'll go ahead and put this QR code up. You'll see here, I think Jill will do a better job than I will to describe fully what you can find in this, but it will walk through exactly how we begin with a partner country to start identifying the constraints, what are typical agricultural sectors that we're able to work, agricultural projects that might have, you know, the most bang for your buck, let's say. And then, as I mentioned, the IFPRI MCC co-design toolkit for how you actually can prioritize where investments are going and whether those investments might have undue impacts. For example, if you're really increasing productivity, that might be good for food prices, but it might harm the farmers who are actually producing it. So the more we can use these tools before we get into projects, it's a good complement for also taking lessons learned from past projects, and really allows us to build out programs that have the most up-to-date thinking before we get going on them. So again, I hope I piqued your interest on this. I'm not sure if you'll be able to get the QR code because of the screen here, but those online should be able to access it. So I'm going to set the stage for my colleague Sarah in a moment here. She's going to dive into some of our interesting results in the agriculture sector, but I'm just going to set the stage on why this is important, and, you know, why not only accurate information is important, but timely information is important. So I think, as you all know, budgets are limited, whether we're talking about donor funding or Ministry of Agriculture funding. You know, our partners need to be both dollar and penny wise when they're making investments. And so having the most accurate information on where you're lifting production, or where markets are going, where there are production constraints. These are incredibly important, not just for donors, but for ministries of agriculture as they set their priorities. And of course, we know that sometimes these priorities, maybe they're slightly value-based, such as, you know, increasing self-sufficiency or sovereignty over food. So that's already a challenge. But then if you don't have reliable data, how do you make determinations on where you're competitive in the agriculture space? And these are just a few reasons why I think, you know, MCC is very able to partner with our countries, our partner countries, and insist on data transparency, insist on making sure we are innovating on the tools. Certainly, you know, of the challenges for capturing agricultural data, the fact that smallholder production is mostly rural already tells you it's going to be costly. It also tells you that there's going to be likely some challenges in getting accurate information. So in MCC's past, I think Sarah will get a little bit more into this, just estimating yield, productivity is a really big challenge. Or something as seemingly simple as knowing the denominator, so that's the surface area of where a farmer is producing. That's a challenge. And if you don't have those numbers right, you can get really unrealistic yields that make the data almost not worth influencing future policies. And, you know, that that is not a good recipe for future investments, whether it's, again, the Ministry of Agriculture's budget or a donor, your projects, or MCC's projects. If we don't have reliable baseline information of what's going on in the sector, it's really hard to plan efficient and targeted investments. So let me stop there. I think I'm going to turn it over to Sarah here to give us a little bit of a flavor of what we've done in the land and agriculture space for evaluating our projects. Sorry, one more slide? You sure?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Kai. Okay, I'm Sarah Lane, Senior Director for our evaluation side of our portfolio in M&E at MCC. And as others have mentioned, MCC spends a lot of time and resources and care on our evaluations. We really care about our results and our evidence. We evaluate every single project that we fund, and we have a lot of staff and budget towards our evaluations. So for many years, I have been focused on the evaluation of our the ag portfolio of our evaluations. And so Kai and I worked together quite a bit on sort of thinking through our measurement challenges around ag. And we have, in our 20 years at MCC, 60 active and completed evaluations in ag and land. That's a lot. And that is actually, that represents about 28% of our evaluation portfolio. So you can see we have quite a large portfolio of evaluations that continues to grow. And so that's really a lot of evidence that we have thought a lot about, taken the learning from those evaluations and tried to think about how we can do things better. And as others have said, I'll also just give a little plug for our evidence platform. Every evaluation and all of the materials surrounding the evaluation, including the instruments and the data, are all online and public. So if you're interested, please take a look at that. Okay, but on to ag and land. So we have been thinking a lot about our measurement challenges in ag. So in a traditional ag evaluation, you will do a large household survey at best 3 times, if you're lucky. You'll have a baseline before the intervention starts, you'll have a midline, and you'll have an end line. So these large, expensive, lumpy surveys in ag. And, you know, they're sort of the old workhorse that we have been using for decades to decide whether or not our ag programs are effective. But I think, as probably most people in this room know, they come with a lot of challenges as well. There are measurement issues in these surveys. There's recall bias. I mean, anybody in this room asked a farmer 6 months earlier what their yields were? Anybody ever done that? Some hands? Right, so that happens, right? That's been sort of like the best we can do in some cases. And that's extremely challenging. So that's not to mention other weather shocks, climate shocks, price shocks that might happen in the off years or in the years that we're measuring, right? So you have all of these challenges around measurement in ag. And so about 6 years ago, we at MCC started thinking about if we could use satellite imagery and remote sensing to do this in a better way. And, you know, we started smallish. We had 2 evaluations that were kind of coming to an end. And we decided to sort of throw in some remote sensing into those evaluations just as a pilot to see what would happen. And we got some rather interesting results out of those evaluations. So the first one was Burkina, which I think is famous in our MCC circles, where we decided to add remote sensing at the end line. And it turned out that we got a lot of different numbers from the remote sensing and the crop cuts and the household surveys. And we ran out of time to triangulate. And so we had this sort of confounding final report, what was right. And the differences between the yields in those were enormous. Then we moved to Senegal. Similar situation, we had just finished a midline. We had a big irrigation infrastructure in Senegal. And all we found out from the midline, which where we asked farmers, like, what are you growing? We found out that they weren't really using the irrigation. We didn't know why. So part of our end line was to construct a time series analysis that we could use with the remote sensing, with the satellites, to sort of just watch what was happening along those irrigation perimeters. The program logic had posited in that particular evaluation that we would be growing in 3 seasons, but we really didn't see that. And we could have this remote sensing to inform our end line, to ask the right questions, right? So we could use this technology. So this was sort of piquing our interest. How can we use remote sensing to think through our measurement challenges for evaluation? And then, as it turns out, also for monitoring. And monitoring is really useful to the folks that are actually implementing these programs, right? So we turned to Niger. And we started to think through, we have these irrigation perimeters in Niger. We started to think through, how can we use remote sensing to see what's happening with these farmers in Niger? Rather than just a standard baseline, interim, and end line, can we look at things like crop types that are changing? Can we look at fallowed land? And can we look at sort of that holy grail of remote sensing? Can we look at yields? And so we started thinking a lot. We partnered with NASA. I can't take credit for this. It was one of my colleagues that did all of this work. But MCC partnered with NASA to start using their satellite imagery to start measuring whether or not farmers on these irrigation perimeters were doing things that were different, that they were following what we had posited in our program logic. And part of this technology, we discovered that the remote sensing from the satellites was not as high a resolution as we had hoped, right? So the satellite imagery is 10-meter imagery. And what else is difficult about satellite imagery? If there's clouds, you can't see. And so while we had much more high frequency data than every couple of years, it might not have been as much as we wanted. So what did we do? We started thinking about other kinds of remote sensing. We started thinking about drones. So we hired some local operators to actually fly drones over the fields to get centimeter level resolution, which is incredible, right? So you can actually see the kinds of crops that are there. You use that, you train your models with crop cut data, and you can actually come close to approximating crop type. Yields are still tricky, but maybe folks in the room, and I think NASA is after us, maybe they have some more to say about that. You know, we are really sort of pushing the envelope in this area. And I think, you know, there's a lot of excitement here. We continue to have a lot of excitement around using satellite imagery and remote sensing for measurement, and we're continuing to push this in other countries. In Lesotho, we're looking at it pre-program. We're looking at what's happening on the ground using satellite imagery before the program even started. And in Morocco, we're using a lot of crop cuts to look at these things with our evaluation. So our evidence is still continuing. We're still learning. I will just make one last point about the cost saving. So a lot of people will say, well, these household surveys, they're so expensive. So looking at having the satellite imagery is going to be so much cheaper. It's not 100% clear to me yet that it's cheaper. Yes, you get better information. That is true. But you get a lot of data. You have to deal with that data. You have to process that data. So there is still work to be done. And I will pause there and turn it back to Casey.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. We have about 20 minutes for your questions. So hopefully you have just heard a lot of information across MCC's land and ag portfolio. And so you have a panel here that's eager to answer and hear them. I have a couple myself, but I want to turn to the audience first. So do we have any questions off the bat, or yes, excellent. We'll start with you, please, and we'll come right to you.
Hi, I'm Beverly Hatcher-Boo. I'm the Deputy Director of Programs at Development Gateway at Iris Center. I have a two-part question. My first is around existing data, so this is directed to you, Jill. Hi. What role do you see for interoperability of existing systems as part of your investment portfolio, especially about land that sort of impacts of land? A part of why land grabbing happens is because of a lack of ability of systems to speak to each other. I'm so curious about how you see that as part of MCC investments. Part two of that same question directed to you. I'm sorry, Sarah, around evidence. Along the lines of interoperability, it's really hard to measure the impact of systems change over time, and I'm so curious how you think about it from your lens, how you've seen or measured or thought about is one of the indicators of success within an investment plan it's like the human body. If it's working well largely, you can't see it externally, but when it's not working, you know. And this is something that we struggle with a lot in teaching. So typically working with humans and processes that are very difficult to quantify. And so curious from the perspective of what you might say along the lines for this
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's do one in a time for non. If we need to start to bunch, we can. But since we had a twofer there, let me turn to the panel. Jill, can I ask you to start us off?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I love that we get to talk about it because it's a challenge. It's an issue that we get you and so the obvious benefit of digital systems for records and information, be it alphanumeric in terms of names on a land title or geographic in terms of what is located where, what size is it. What's its relation to other plots around it. Technology makes all of this information much more widely available to more people, right? Not just the people in the physical office where the file cabinets are kept, but anyone, anywhere. And this is exceptionally important in a given national government, regional governments, municipal governments, district office, right? And so we struggle, I'll use that word, we struggle with how can we help institutions line up all of this information in one place so that everyone is singing from the same song sheet. So in one go, one set of layers, even if they're pulling from different areas of authority and responsibility, we can see planning guidelines and planning boundaries, flood hazard maps, risk zones, land rights, environmental sort of information, plans, guidelines, resources that have certain access and use rights associated with them. Ideally, all of that would be stacked on top of each other so that anyone can see at any time problems, conflicts, obstacles related to some policy decision or some private investment decision. It's the technology and the software and the use of technology systems that make that very difficult, right? Electricity, internet, can different softwares in use by different institutions talk to each other. All of those things are challenges, and I don't think we found a solution other than that it takes a lot of time. What we have decided is, keeping it as simple and targeted on the goals that we want is best. Really making sure that there's as much access by as many people as possible to the information that different institutions do have, which allows for much broader knowledge and understanding of what's happening there, what the rights and obligations and implications are associated with different areas. And our hope is that as software gets easier used, storage is easier, electricity internet is more stable, more accessible, faster, that this interoperability challenge will start to fall away. But
so I might maybe I'm using a little selective hearing in your question to push on something that I talk about a lot. I'm in irrigation, so MCC is dedicated a significant portion of its agriculture budget to building irrigation infrastructure. And here is an example where we as investors in irrigation would like to show up on the scene with our partner countries having a full and broad sense of what their irrigation sector looks like, right? And so where a large-scale irrigation investment might look good for a national priority, is it the most effective use of resources? Or in fact, is smaller scale or farmer-led irrigation? This is a debate. This is something I know she works on a lot. But here's an area where we would love to have our partner governments be equipped with the same kind of thinking that we're using to evaluate our investments? Does it make sense to invest in large-scale irrigation? And do you have enough time-sensitive data? So just one evaluation just gives you a snapshot of time, how that investment's working right now. But you mentioned human-centered approach. That's the most critical part of keeping any infrastructure going, whether it's large-scale or just a small pump to get 5 meters in the ground. Needs to be maintained, and so can our partner governments, use more frequent data monitoring to determine whether large-scale irrigation is the next priority, or in fact, this farmer-led approach that's actually having a lot more success in rural areas. So that's one area where I constantly say it's great for us to house this information, but the more our partner governments are able to quickly adapt, hopefully the costs go down, that they are able to start using this as they build up their, we can call them wish lists here, but their priorities, their national set of investments should be based on this information.
So I have a clarifying question. So are you talking about some of the policy institutional reform piece of it? Yes. Because I think when the systems work, we can proxy for that. How often? So PIR has been a very challenging thing for us to evaluate. However, similar to sort of this work in remote sensing, we've also, our division's also been thinking a lot more about PIR in general. We have a partnership with 3IE to do what we call a PIR metric menu, so that's all public. And it thinks through interventions that are appropriate and then ways to evaluate them that are appropriate. And so that's sort of a nice resource to check out. It's an evolving resource. My colleague Julie Woodrock is the one that spearheads that. Sure. Found him on LinkedIn. You can find him next to talking about it.
Wonderful. I know we had a question here, and then I am going to take 2 questions, and then we'll go to you right there. Please start.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Hazel Hanafi. I'm an economist working at ICTforAg, and I actually specialize on methodological innovations around gender research. So in general, I'm really curious to hear about any lessons you've learned around closing gender gaps and social inclusion with respect to the different aspects of work you talked about. And then I just want to point to maybe 2 resources that may or may not be already on your radar. So one is that just on the remote sensing, you talked about specific methodologies. I don't know if you're already working with the 50 by 2030 initiative. This is and they're cross-validating. The World Bank especially believes that they're having cross-validating these different methodologies. So I think if that's not yet a partnership, that might be good to explore what they're finding here. And then the other resource I wanted to point to, this is a shameless plug because we're a grantee of MCC where we did Way Up for Value Chains pilot in as part of the second phase of the Philippines Compact when it was being prepared to go. It did not go forward. But just to mention that there were a lot of resources that were developed as part of that, and it would be great to see that maybe reflected. I don't know if you can touch on that a little bit as well. So thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm very interested in the drones over fields and so forth. About 15 years ago, a colleague of mine was doing that in Malawi to assess if farmers had implemented conservation ag. But the ethics review board ended up saying that every farmer will need to see a picture of the drone beforehand and give consent for that drone to fly over, which, as you can imagine, increases the costs dramatically, and various other things can be affected. So I'm just wondering, what has been the evolution of ethic review boards, to your knowledge, also other people in the room, regarding flying drones? And of course, we know there's legislation, there's lots of other things, but there's also ethics review boards that might not agree with drones flying over farmers' fields. Yeah, if you have any insights on that, given that we talk about digital
Absolutely.
solutions.
Two great questions.
Who would like to kick us off for either or both of them?
Do you have anything to say about the gender associated evaluation side?
So I do. I have an example. So we don't, our evaluations, they look at the program logic and measure up to the objective of our programs. And there's one really fascinating example in Malawi where we had a land management project that offered grants to different groups to try to prevent runoff to the river because the river had a lot of weed infestations and was causing trouble for the power plant that we were building. Long way to say that we were working with women on sort of land management practices. And what we found was that the grants that were income generating and incorporated gender were the most successful. And there were two types of grants. There was gender only, there's three types of grants. Gender only grants and land only grants, and then grants that were gender that incorporated land and grants that were land incorporated gender. And the most successful were the land ones that incorporated gender, right? Because the objective was land, and women were primarily the ones that were managing the land and having practices that were useful to that were relevant to land practices. They were the ones that were managing that. And so when gender was incorporated, those were the most successful grants. So that's one example where we found that gender integration was really critical. And then some of the other examples that I can think of off the top of my head are a little more mixed.
I would just add on the gender and inclusion point, we address the issue differently depending on what we're doing in a given place, right? Sometimes and depending on the context in which we're working and the prevailing legal framework and customary land management kind of rules of the game that people are familiar with. And this can range from systems related investment that's making sure that there are enough fields when you get to the screen to enter in names, right? It often happens that there's just one box. And so if there's only one box, then that just sort of forces one name to go in the box. But that's it. But there's nothing in the legal framework, maybe in the example country, that would prevent adding multiple names, or maybe there's the framework or reform that encourages. But early drafts of systems or forms, inadvertently just have administrative approaches that have an effect of limiting it. So we've had examples of addressing, even in these very simple ways, some things that may be getting in the way of women's access to land and to land rights. And we're also, one of the things that we have been talking about a lot recently is sort of other ways that women access land rights beyond sort of classic rights recognition or rights formalization programs. And in our Morocco rural land project and the rural land activity that just closed about a year ago, we were able to help the government of Morocco implement for the first time a new inheritance-related reform. And so, looking increasingly at inheritance as a major pathway by which women can access rights to land, I get the numbers wrong, but the measures that the team leading the Morocco work has been using is that without the reform, I think it was about 1% of title holders would have been women. And as a result of the work of the government's reform and the work of the program to help build awareness around the reform, 34% of rights holders were women at the end of the project. And so exploring sort of that pathway as a way into women's land rights is something
Maybe I'll just do a quick response for the ag programming. It's an example that I mentioned, and I swear people are going to get excited by agricultural tax reform, such an important policy, but it is one of those areas that the starting point, and it has a huge effect across entire rural populations, but it's one of these things, if you don't really push for the measurement to figure out the impact on women or youth, you're going to end up with gender biased data. And so that is one area where, tax administration doesn't think through gender when they're thinking about evaluating their policies, and it's incredibly important for the international donor community to say, all right, we'll work with you on this, but you do need to go the extra effort to measure the impact. So that's one example. And then your plug on 50 by 2030, it's not exactly I know it wasn't a question, but I do want to say MCC recently in Niger, we had been supporting the government on building their statistical capacity. So I think it kind of relates to the theme of what we're talking about. And what we found, and I don't want to overgeneralize too much, but a lot of existing, particularly agriculture, let's just say rural data collection approaches end up being quite bloated. So they do really well when donors show up and fund, and there's a push to hire a lot of enumerators, and there's fuel for motos, and they're able to go out to rural areas and collect data for a short amount of time. When that funding expires, agricultural statistics, fall back into a state where they're no longer reliable, they're not timely, sometimes they're not worth publishing. And so, this is, I hope, the future where we're able to support, I know I'm saying this again, but support initiatives like the remote sensing, linking up local data, be able to extrapolate that out across larger portions of the swaths of a country will help lower the cost of data collection, and I hope just increase overall quality and availability of agricultural statistics. So we are big fans. We're supporting Niger, but MCC only works in democratic countries, and our funding for the statistics ran out recently. But that is an important initiative.
I want to make sure we get the
drone question.
Drone's question start.
I want to ask, how does MCC make the decisions for the countries that invest? So you could come after.
That's a great question. Do you want to do the drone?
So for the drones, so far they've, I think, only been in Niger. And I believe you would know this better than I would, but we did go through ethical considerations.
Yeah, no, as you said, we follow local. In fact, we engage local firms to do this. So enabling environment for data collection and running drones is what we rely upon. If there were the challenges you mentioned, that would make it very difficult to capture. I mean, there's where a good partnership with our governments hopefully fills the gap. But luckily, we haven't run into that specific instance yet.
We got approvals for it. Like there was a whole, even after we were no longer able to support them, we were still able to get approvals. And
I might be going a little too far out on a limb. Sarah can bring me back, but there are other ways if you can, you maybe want to get into this, but if you can do a really small sample size and be able to build an algorithm that then you can apply to satellite imagery. These are cutting edge things that she has doubts on, but in the future, I'm sure they'll get better. And so maybe there are ways you can get around privacy concerns in the ag space.
Yeah, possibly, if you could, the crop cuts are running the models. I don't know, you need a sample size, you need to be able to run the models, you need to be able to see things.
And you can pick the right.
And you have to have crop cuts in every year to run the models. So far, you can't do them out of season. So it's hard to say. I mean, it's all still quite new.
But if we're talking about the future, you could work with agriculture research institutes, get the right initial framework, and maybe apply it without using drones. Let's hope.
Just the satellites, maybe.
And then just super quick, because we have 1 minute, the way that we determine in what sector we're investing is once a country is selected, MCC and the partner country, the government, work together to do this constraints to growth diagnostic, which basically just kind of looks at every conceivable sector to see which is kind of performing the worst or is the biggest drain or hindrance to the economy, and then that's the sector that we start to kind of drill in and figure out the project, which is why you hear about ag and irrigation work in Niger and a land tenure in Morocco and energy in Malawi, and there's a water and sector project in Timor, because it all is dependent on the country and the context and what the government and MCC want to focus on in a given year. So I'm going to give each panelist 30 seconds for the one thing that you want folks to take away or do, and I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to say evidence.mcc.gov has all of the evaluations and evidence. You can filter for land, for ag, for gender differentials, and you can find all of the evidence here. Jill, 30 seconds.
I'm gonna cede my time. I really just there's just so much important work that so many people are doing around the land and ag nexus and on this technology piece. There's just so much opportunity, but it's also the paradox of choice a little bit, in the sense that there's just so much out there, and anything that any of us can do to help government service providers, donors make decisions around what to invest in that are appropriate for the context and usable by the users is just going to be really, really important. And we need to keep our eye on where technology is moving, but we also need to keep our eyes on what's the problem that we're trying to solve and what's the